The project began, essentially I've known Ed's work for about 15 years, and he started with quarries, which are such a beautiful kind of literal example of the hole that we create in the ground to get the materials to make the things that we think that we need, or that we need. And I was always amazed by the capacity of this work to be transformational without being didactic, and kind of looking at that and wondering how that worked. And I think that is the heart of the power of the work. But when we got together to make a film, it actually came to me through, you'll notice that there's a lot of black and white footage in the film that was shot by a photographer named Jeff Powis, who knew Ed and asked him if he could come on a few trips with him, went with him, shot a bunch of consumer video footage, and then didn't know what to do with it, and asked me to look at it through Daniel Iron, who you met earlier. And I went through those 80, 100 hours of material, and it was it was a lot of material to go through, and made a decision from looking at all of that footage that it was not possible to make a film with just this footage, but if we were going to make a film about Ed, it would be, the work would be the departure point. And I don't know if any of you have seen portrait of artist films, but they tend to fall into a kind of genre, especially photographers. There's always a darkroom moment with the image emerging magically on the paper. And I really didn't want to do that, because I knew that the power of Bertinsky's work was the work. And somebody could come and make a film about his life. His life is interesting too, but I didn't want to do that. And I also wanted to try to find a way of intelligently translating those stills into a time-based medium. So when we talked about that, he was very open to it. So in a sense, the collaboration was one of where he's more an author than a subject. So the vision of the world that you see is the vision of his work, and it is, the frames that you see are extrapolated from his frames. But he's not a subject in the traditional sense. That one sequence in California, he shot the highway footage and the container footage. But other than that, the stills, other than that, he didn't shoot anything else. The stills situation was complicated because we were basically shut down. We were not allowed to film in this area because it was the biggest coal distribution center in China. And, as far as you looked in any direction were these pyramids of coal. It was an extraordinary place, but it was a windy day. And the coal dust was blowing around, and they thought that it looked dirty, and they didn't want us to shoot. And so, interestingly enough, the motion picture camera is always more threatening. So they asked us to turn that off, but then our cinematographer, Peter Mettler, who was very much involved in also helping translate these stills into film, just started taking still photographs. So we felt like, even though there was something self-referential about it, that it was important to tell that story, because that's the kind of the kind of access issues that he has all the time. Those are those kind of access issues. And also, for us, we were always traveling with a minder, and there is still this very much a desire to control perception there. We had to negotiate every time we turned the camera on, essentially. Not that I mind that much, because I feel, coming from a Western country and sort of parachuting in and assuming that you have something meaningful to say about another country is a difficult position to be in. I mean, it's a tricky position to be in. And we were intending to shoot in a lot of different locations, but because the China footage was so strong, we decided to keep the film to the microcosm of this China essay and try to make the film about, the film is about all of us and our participation in the cycle of consumption and waste, and in the Industrial Revolution that China is now going through, which is very much being driven by us in the West. So trying to have a film set in a country but not be a criticism of that country was a big sort of tricky thing that we tried to work out in the edit room. We had a minder with us at all times, and everywhere we went we were met by 2 or 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 foreign affairs officials that were part of that place, that would trail around with us as we were shooting. And the good thing about our minder was that film is boring. Working in film is boring. It takes hours, and we were shooting in Super 16 millimeter, which is not, you have to change reels, and there's all kinds of work to do with that. That you get bored and go off and have a coffee. So he would do that sometimes. He would just sort of wander off because he was bored. But whenever we tried to talk to somebody, an ordinary worker in a factory, somebody by the side of the road, somebody in an area that it was being resettled, that's when we got into trouble, because they didn't want us to talk to people who were not official representatives, and they didn't want somebody to say something that meant that they were disagreeing with the government. And at one point we were in Wushan, which is one of the cities that has a new part to the city, but now is mostly, the old part of the city is covered by water because of the dam. And we were on this muddy slope area where there were still some people that had yet to be relocated who were protesting, as many are in China, about relocation. Either the relocation settlement is not good enough, or they're not being provided proper, compensation, or they're being moved to a place that, is so far away from where they lived before that their entire community fabric has been destroyed. And we were asked to leave because a group of people formed on us, and they wanted to talk to us, and they were interested in what we were doing, and they wanted to tell us their stories. And as soon as there were more than 5 people there, they asked, we had to go. We couldn't go back there the next day. And in the shipyards, if you remember, there's a young woman there who's a welder that I found fascinating. Like, what is this woman doing? I mean, she's young, she should be in school. What's she doing here? That's perhaps a naive Western perspective, but I wanted to ask her about her job and just how did she get there. And we talked to her for about 10 minutes, and she didn't say anything controversial. She just said, my job's boring, and I didn't get into high school, and that's why I'm here. But we were not allowed to go back there the next day because we had talked to this person who was not an official representative, who could have told us something negative. On the last day of the film, there's a scene with a man talking about in Shanghai, in the old city in Shanghai, and there's sort of a burnt-out area, and he talks about people getting beaten up, who are these people who are holdouts, who won't leave their houses. We told our minder that we were going, it was our last day, and that we were going, shopping for souvenirs. And so he went away, and we went and filmed those scenes without him, and almost got arrested at the end of that day. I mean, not whatever. I mean, the police were called, and we managed to get out. It was not that dramatic, but it was one of those situations where we were in a place that we shouldn't have been in, but we wanted to tell that story. I thought there was another question back there. Yes.
Yeah, just curious to know what the impact of seeing these environments firsthand was on you as an individual, and how the experience of seeing these firsthand compares to the experience of seeing one of his photographs.
These photographs are on display, some of them, not a real representative number, but at Flowers Central on Cork Street. So you can see some of them in person, and they're huge prints because he works with a large format camera. So at first, of course, you're overwhelmed by the scale, but then when you look in close, you see that there's incredible detail in these prints and all these inherent narratives in them. One of the advantages of time-based media and having a motion picture camera is that you can put a long lens on, and all of those details that you do not get to see unless you look in close to the picture, we can film those details and follow those stories. And that was always something that we intended to do, to sort of go back and forth between a macro and micro perspective. I have to say that being in some of these landscapes, it's very hard to make them look beautiful, and when compelling visually, aesthetically compelling. And when you see some of these prints, they're stunning aesthetically until you look in close and recoil and realize that what you're looking at is garbage or a great scar in the earth. And I think that Bertinsky's skill in being able to draw you in so that you're interested in looking, what is that, and how big is this thing? And they're often scaleless, so you don't know what's going on. But then when you realize what you're looking at, that sort of process, I think, engenders a very complex dialogue, self-dialogue about your own implication in this whole cycle, which we also tried to do in the film. So some of these places where I would look at and I couldn't see anything that he could take a picture of, and he would take a picture of it and frame it in such a way that it would create that stream of thinking. But I found it devastating. I mean, we were in places where you could do a 360-degree turnaround and see nothing natural in the environment. No birds, no weeds, nothing, like no weeds even. And this wasn't some place outside of civilization. This was places where people were living, where kids were playing, you know. And we're all, it felt to me like the future for us if we don't wake up about how we're using resources and the way that we're living. So it was, the impact was quite great being there. I do think certainly at the moment progress is more important. I don't think there's any question that they value their natural landscape and this pastoral ideal, which is very much, I mean, if you look at any paintings, you know, there's this whole tradition of landscape painting in China that is very much about the depiction of an ideal, in a sense. There's not a lot of that ideal space left, and the gap between the ideal and reality is getting bigger and bigger. So I don't think people really think that those places are gone. They just think they're not where they are at that moment. And the problem with China is, I mean, it's incredibly hypocritical for us to say, we've been through it, we made mistakes, we're still making them, but there's so many of you that you can't make those mistakes or you'll bring us all down, which is essentially what we're saying to them in the West. You know, don't go through this rapid industrialization because of the effects of, you know, the global effects. It's a very tough position to be in. There's no question that they know what those effects are. It's not like they just don't, they're not aware that the environmental costs of this industrialization are huge. They think, you know, as any industrialized country has, that they can clean up later, you know, that you industrialize, get dirty, make money, use that money to clean up the problem later. And I think that the problem is just that the scale is so much bigger, that we're facing something that we've never faced before. So we are all globally responsible for this. And there are already very encouraging signs in China of a strong environmental movement. The Deputy Minister of the Environment, a man named Pan Ye, is very outspoken about the effects of industrialization on water, groundwater, earth, like all of these things that are getting irrevocably polluted. And there are already green cities, carbon neutral cities that are being planned in China that, you know, that other countries, Western countries, have not been able to implement these kind of carbon neutral cities because they just don't have that willing a population, at least in that situation. I mean, if there's anything good to be said about a totalitarian situation, it would be that you can say all building must be green from now on. And there's a possibility that China will be able to clean up a lot faster than Western industrialized countries. However, the day after the DVD was released in Canada, actually the day of the DVD release in Canada, it was already on the streets of Beijing for $1 US with exactly the same cover as the Canadian DVD. And from my friends in China, it's quite widely circulated. So a lot of people see it in more of an underground way. It wouldn't be officially distributed because probably just two reasons. The e-waste sequences, recycling e-waste is technically illegal in China, even though many people do it, and drawing attention to that is a problem because it is a cottage industry, people do it at home, but the government knows that it's toxic, so what that has had the effect of is that people have now been driven indoors, so now they do it inside with the windows shut instead of outside on their porches, which is worse. That's one issue, and then the other issue is these holdouts, because there's a tremendous number of people in China who are protesting at relocation for one reason or another. And interestingly enough, it's like an incipient sign of democracy in that country, in that these people are not immediately jailed or they're allowed to protest. There's just too many of them, I think. But it's allowing a new voice of protest. Now, everything that's happened with Tibet and the Olympics is a whole other, you know, face of China, of course. But it's the question of, you know, is it good to, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, but is it good to give the Olympics to China because then the world is more aware, and is the Olympics in China the best thing that ever happened to the Tibet crisis, or the opposite? Should you never allow a country like this, with the human rights record that it has, to host this global, you know, celebration? I don't really know the answer to that, but I'm still thinking about it. Thank you all very much for coming.